As we continue our study of the book of Genesis, we now get to the story of the sojourn of Jacob with his uncle Laban in chapters 29 and 30 and the first part of chapter 31. Remember, as we left Jacob with the last lesson, he was at Bethel. He was fleeing. He had seen the angels of God, and he had this promise from God that he was going to be delivered, and God would watch over him, and he would someday come back to the place where he had come from. So as he goes toward this well up in Haran, up in Syria, he goes to the very same place where the servant of Abraham had gone when Rebekah was brought back years earlier. As he goes there, he sees the shepherds, and we get a little bit of the story of the daily workings of the way these people worked. The normal idea would be that they would water the animals in the evening, and yet here they were in the middle of the day, and it would seem that they had to change their procedure here because of the cover of the well being so heavy. So as Jacob sees that these shepherds are all gathered around, then he, in his strength, when he sees Rachel, he's going to show how macho he is, and he pulls back the stone from the well and then waters the animals. We get an idea already here, even though it's probably maybe only a couple hundred miles away, which is quite a distance, of course, at this point. But even at that distance, we find out that Jacob is kind of surprised that not everyone does things the way he was used to seeing them done at home. A lot of times the wells are with a cover over them, of course, so that people will not fall in. When you are digging a well, you're going to dig down into the ground, and then the water will gradually seep in from the side when you get it deep enough. And so they put a flat covering over it so that people who are wandering through would not fall in. It was very typical at the site where Kathy and I were on our archaeological dig back in 1972 to see 4 or 5 or even 6 different groups of animals, the white sheep and the black goats, as they were gathered together around the well by little Tel Masos where we were digging. And they would wait their turn. There was kind of just a little square concrete section by that particular well, maybe about 12 feet by 12 feet with the hole in the middle and then a smaller lid put on that. Usually the women and the children are the ones who take care of the animals. And in the situations that we have seen, it's not uncommon to see a couple of kids along the side of the hillsides, like in the Judean hill country, with maybe 15, 20, 25, 30 sheep and goats. And a flock was always made up of the sheep and the goats. You might think of this, that the sheep are for the wool and thus for clothing, and the goats are for the milk. So they wouldn't be probably eating as much meat in that time period unless they were quite well to do. Well, Jacob is there. He finds his cousin, his uncle Laban's daughter Rachel, and is immediately infatuated with her. And when he has stayed a month with Uncle Laban and is trying to figure out what arrangement they will have, then his uncle says, well, why don't you just stay here and work for me? You might remember that with the story of Abraham, Abraham's servant brings camels full of riches and rings that he puts on the hand of Rebekah. Jacob now comes with nothing. He has no bride price to pay. He has no goods with which he can arrange a marriage for himself. He is actually kind of going in as an extended family member, but we might suspect that at this point Laban does not have any boys yet, and Laban might, at the very beginning of this whole affair, be thinking, this is the way I will get sons for myself. I'll get grandsons by having Jacob marry my daughter. And of course, in his mind all these years, it's that he's going to marry Leah off first and then Rachel. Otherwise, Leah might never get married. So Jacob agrees to the idea of the wage of how much he is going to work for. We might stand back a little bit and look at the whole idea of the bride price now. The Hebrew word for that is mohar, M-O-H-A-R, and the bride price has a couple of different functions to it. Many people are very irritated, particularly in our day and age, about the buying of women, buying of human beings, and considering that to be a form of slavery. In the ancient world, first of all, the father of the bride is going to ask the question, can this man provide for my daughter? One way to say that he can is to have him put the money up front and show that he is able to pay for the livelihood for both himself and the future wife by having some monies that he has set aside. And that's really the intent of the story with Abraham and Isaac. But the other part of what goes on here is that when there is this purchase arrangement, that doesn't necessarily mean that the girl never gets any benefit from that money. The whole story, as I've told it in class at times, led me to be quite surprised one time, quite a few years ago now, when one of my Hmong students came up after class and said, well, you know, I was bought. And the idea of a purchase price, in her situation, she said it was something like $7,000 that her husband had saved up to give to her parents, and then another $6,000 for the wedding. So either by purchase or by earning or by borrowing from family members, a young man will provide this money to his future in-laws. But this young lady said, and we detect it way back these many thousand years ago in the text, this young lady said that her parents would keep that money, and then if the marriage went well, then they would give that money back. We notice in the story about Leah and Rachel that they complain, our father has spent the money. He is giving away our bride price. So instead of having the money in advance, Jacob is really kind of earning his way in to the family. Some would suggest that if he was going to leave, then he ought to leave with absolutely nothing. He came with nothing, and what he was really getting was simply the chance to have a family, but he had no rights to take that family with him. So there's a little bit of question about exactly all of what the procedures are, but we're right within the realm of the Near Eastern ways of dealing with family life. Jacob is willing to work, first of all, for the 7 years for Rachel, and he says that she's very beautiful and that Leah is not as attractive. We might ask the question, well, how old were the girls at this time? And one needs to, again, put two and two together here and make some strong inferences. But the fact that he has to work 7 years for Rachel, one would assume that Rachel, maybe when Jacob got there, was maybe only 6, 7, 8 years old. In other words, she is at an age where it's going to be several years before she is even going to be able to bear children. And we can get this idea because once the trade is made and Leah is given, he doesn't have to work 7 more years before he gets Rachel. He only works 1 more week, or he waits that week for the bridal ceremonies with Leah, and then he's given Rachel, and so he works 7 years on the front end for Rachel, gets Leah, and then he marries Rachel a week later, and then on the other end he works another 7 years. That's not as troublesome for people who read the text as the fact that there is bigamy going on, and not only that, but that there are also servant girls, Zilpah, who is given to Leah, and Bilhah, who is given to Rachel. And the best I can come up with at this point is God says, I work through the various customs of the various peoples. Everyone has ways in which they do things that I do not approve of. So the Bible is not some sort of a record where just because it's in the Bible, then it must be okay with God. God gets nothing but sinners to work with, and thus he is going to, I don't know if the right word is tolerate or put up with or love them in spite of what they are doing. The relationship with Isaac and Rebekah, we're told only that he took her into his own tent and was comforted for the death of his mother. So we don't really know exactly what to make of all these arrangements. It was common in the ancient world that if a man died, that another near relative would take the man's wife if he died childless, and that wife then, the first child she bore, would in essence be the one who would inherit the woman's husband's property, even though it might be a cousin or a younger brother who would have actually gotten her pregnant. So there is a strong emphasis on keeping the gifts of inheritance within the family, And we notice also here with the Rachel story that when she sees that she's not bearing children, that she gives her servant girl to Jacob, and Bilhah bears two children, and the phrase again is bearing the child on Rachel's knees. And then Leah gives her servant girl, and there are two children born there. And then Leah herself, who had borne the first four, Reuben and Simeon and Levi and Judah, has two more children. We have this little story about the mandrakes that Reuben found, some sort of aphrodisiac that was supposed to guarantee good success in having children. And we find a kind of a sadness as we listen to the story of Leah, how no matter how hard she tried, her husband was never going to be happy with her. He didn't want to be married to Leah. She gives 6 of the 12 sons of Israel, and yet it does not matter at all. Jacob really never treats her as the beloved wife, even though she has provided him with all these children. We even have in the books of Moses laws and instructions about what to do when a man has more than one wife, and the whole counsel is he does not get the right before God to show favoritism. We might also remember the fact that because of many wars that are going on, there'll be a lot of men, young men, who have died, much like what happens during the Great Wars, the First and Second World War and Vietnam in our country. Many of those young men who have gone in those battles and never come back will sometimes leave young wives or fiancés, but particularly if they've left a young wife, then in the ancient world, someone finally had to show responsibility for her. We find a similar kind of example in the story of Ruth, where Ruth's husband Mahlon has died, along with her brother-in-law Kilian and their father, and so Naomi says, "You stay where you are, I'm going back home," and instead Ruth goes along and then finds Boaz, the second in line really for her inheritance, and she then becomes a wife for Boaz, and in that way their first son will inherit the property that had originally belonged to Naomi's husband. So as these stories are passed on and as the events take place, we find that the next stage in the process is that Jacob has now come to live with his father-in-law, with Laban, and Laban is tricking him. Laban is continually changing the rules of the game as the first 14 years had been fulfilled, and then we get on to those last 6 years before Jacob actually goes back. And so the idea is, well, so that they can keep clear exactly whose sheep and goats are whose, Jacob will only get the sheep and goats that are marked with various spots and markings. And the result of that is that 3 days before the dividing up of all the sheep and the goats, it says Laban, or just before that, that Laban takes the ones that are marked, spotted, and all of that, and he removes them 3 days, has his sons, who now all of a sudden show up in the story, has his sons remove them. So when Jacob gets the flock that he is supposed to get his kind of mixed colored sheep and goats from, he has nothing but white sheep and black goats. And another thing that bothers people as they read these stories, the whole thing about the fact that Jacob takes these sticks and he strips the bark off, and you can see the little dots and marks, and it says that he puts those in front of the sheep when they are in heat, and that's why they bear these spotted colored animals, and that he only does that with the real strong ones, and the weak ones he doesn't do that, and so his flocks get stronger and Laban's flocks get weaker. The real intent of it, of course, is that Jacob probably did, in his own mind, think that's how it would happen, but God, of course, was simply blessing him, and even in ancient times they may have sort of sat back and kind of laughed a bit and said, yeah, that's how he thought it was working, but it was really God who was giving the blessing. So Jacob is 20 years with his father-in-law Laban. Remember that he will come back yet and bury his own father Isaac. He came with absolutely nothing. He has a lot all of a sudden, and God appears to him in a dream. And so the time when he leaves and goes back home, these a couple of hundred miles back home to the land of Canaan at that point, later named after him, of course, the land of Israel. When he goes back, after those 20 years, he has possessions, even though technically he should have left with nothing. The daughters say, well, our father has spent our bride price anyway, so why does it matter whether we stay? He has, in essence, written us out of the will. This may be that when Laban had no sons, then the grandsons were important. Once his own sons come along, then the grandchildren are sort of shunted to the side. And so Jacob says, well, I guess it's time for me to go back home. My God has appeared to me and has promised that he would be with me, so let's go. So in this juncture, what we find is God blesses Jacob, even though he has sinned against the family by stealing the birthright. Jacob gets his possessions from God multiplying the gifts. And the ongoing nature of this promise is one thing that we can notice here. God had said, I'll be with you, I'll bless you. He had left with absolutely nothing, comes to a family member, and God has done the blessing of Jacob. So now he has camels and cattle, we're told as well. 11 sons. Of course, finally Rachel in the end does bear Joseph, and then Benjamin will be born when they get back to the land of promise. And so they're leaving with quite a lot. We note this one little mention of the fact that Rachel steals the teraphim. We'll talk about that more in the next section. But one little other observation that's kind of funny is the story about the name of Joseph. It says, may God give me another one. And I always think that would be kind of funny name to have, that if you had the name Joseph and it was given to you because your mother said, well, I sure hope I have another kid, that doesn't mean Joseph is very important. It's almost like, well, maybe I'll get another one and then I would really be happy. Note how Rachel doesn't have children right away. Joseph is child number 11 already. Just like Rebecca went 20 years without bearing children, and Sarah, of course, even after she got to the land of promise, was waiting another 25 years before she had children. So among the other stories, we have these family tensions that have developed. The problem now that Leah and Rachel will have with each other, it's not real strong, but you can detect it in the fact that Leah says, give me those mandrakes, I'd like to use those mandrakes tonight to have your husband come to me, and that tension about the fact that no matter what she's done, she's not loved. There is a phrase in this section that Jacob loved Rachel and hated Leah. We might get a better sense of this, that it's not really a love-hate every time those words are used, but had a preference for and was not so drawn to. And the nuance of the language here is very important as well. The overarching theme, of course, is God says, I'll be with you, I'll bless you, and we see the blessings just kind of mushroom. What God had promised to Jacob, that he would go back to the land as a rich man, is now taking place. What happens after this, then, will be the tensions as he goes back, and the questions in the rest of the book about who will be his descendant, who will take over and serve him. So thank you as you continue to be involved in the Bible study. I realize there are a lot of questions about society that we cannot resolve in terms of how do we use the Bible for today, but maybe it ought to give us caution not to be too quick to say we have to have just this one way of doing everything. We certainly know that if it's in the Bible, that doesn't mean it's right, but it may be indeed that something is there that God says in that time that was the best way for the people to survive. I thank you for your continued study and interest, and God's blessings to you as he continues to shed his blessings and put his power on you as well. Thank you very much.